Joined by our political editor David Speers for your analysis. David, were there any big surprises you saw?
Oh, look, there are a few surprises, certainly in the shift. Arthur Sinodinos going to Washington as Australia's next ambassador. A little bit of time to go before that takes place. And Mitch Fifield to New York as ambassador to the United Nations. They I think, are the big surprises today. But look, the main senior ministers stay in place. I think the other changes the Prime Minister's announced here all make sense at first blush. I think some of the interesting ones are bringing emissions back together with the energy portfolio. As you heard me ask earlier there, they were split apart. Melissa Price was given environment and responsibility for emissions. Angus Taylor was just energy. Melissa Price has been demoted. There's no other way of describing that. And emissions come back together. And I've already had some feedback from the energy sector who welcome that. So I think that makes sense. I think the breakup of some of these National Party portfolios are quite interesting as well. As you know, Barnaby Joyce, I assume, will no longer be envoy because we didn't hear anything about it. We heard Warren Entsch being named as an envoy for the Great Barrier Reef. But you've now got David Littleproud taking not just agriculture per se, because Bridget McKenzie now will take that, and I'm interested to see how the overlap happens here, but she'll be agriculture while he will look after a lot of the things you would normally associate with the agriculture portfolio: water resources, drought, rural finance, natural disaster and emergency management. So they will have overlapping duties, I suspect, in those roles, but David Littleproud has proven himself I think to be quite a strong performer within the Nationals and within the government, so important to keep him there. Look, beyond that, there are a number of other really interesting changes here with the industrial relations and employment side of things. Christian Porter adds industrial relations to Attorney General. Now, of course, Attorney General used to cover so many things, but when Home Affairs was set up, ASIO and all these agencies, AFP and so on, went across to Home Affairs. So now it is it's a reduced portfolio, but still an important one. But now Christian Porter will add IR to that as well. Michaelia Cash coming back into some of the roles she used to hold, not IR, though, importantly, and we know the trouble that we saw during her time there, but back into employment, small and family business, and that's going to be it's a natural constituency for the Liberal Party and an important role for them to take on. So, look, I'm not surprised, and particularly to see a West Australian in that role as well, with Melissa Price taking on lighter duties, if you will. Look, the rest of the changes, a few promotions there of people you'd say are close to Scott Morrison. People like Alex Hawke, people like Stuart Robert, who's going into cabinet with his role as well. Alan Tudge is a big winner as well. And look, yeah, so still going through. We only just got this towards the end of the press conference, so going through some of the other changes. But as I say, I think most of them do make sense. David Coleman is not in cabinet, but remains Minister for Immigration, Citizenship, Migrant Services and Multicultural Affairs. And I think this is coming back from it used to be in immigration, was carved out to social services. I think this is interesting that it's coming back into the overarching Home Affairs portfolio. But David Coleman, as the Minister reporting to Peter Dutton, Immigration, Citizenship, Migrant Services and Multicultural Affairs is an interesting move there as well. So, look, a number of practical structural changes that do make sense. Those who've won in today's announcement, I'm not surprised to see. Melissa Price was always going to be a loser. Mitch Fifield, we speculated as long as a week ago that he would be dropped as well. But the Prime Minister says it was his call. He's decided instead to take this role of ambassador to the UN, and that's a pretty plum gig, I've got to say.
And it opens up those positions in the Senate. So there was some speculation today that that might be a way to get Jim Molan back in.
Yes. Now, this is what he can't answer at the moment today, because the Senate vacancy is not there yet. But the two moves here, there will be a lot of speculation that Jim Molan will take Arthur Sinodinos' Senate spot. And when a senator decides to leave Parliament, you don't have a by-election, of course. It's just the party replacing them. That's how it works. So I would say Jim Molan would be absolutely top of the list there to come in and take that Arthur Sinodinos spot in the Senate. Mitch Fifield's spot in Victoria, I'd already heard earlier this week speculation that Sarah Henderson, who just missed out on Corangamite, will take that position as a Liberal senator. Because she seems to be
a real fighter in Corangamite.
Real fighter, yep. She's a strong performer and, could and should be in the ministry as well if she's got a spot in Parliament. So I wouldn't be surprised to see that. Look, the other really important things I should have mentioned there, Ken Wyatt, the first Indigenous Cabinet Minister and the first Indigenous Minister for Indigenous Australians, they're going to call it here, and a new agency that will be set up as well. Look, I think this is a really important and historic moment. He's proven himself, he's not just there for tokenism, he's proven himself as a strong minister to earn this spot in Cabinet and earn that portfolio responsibility himself. It's never an easy portfolio, and it won't be an easy portfolio here. The government's priority is on dealing with youth suicide and Indigenous suicide generally, but also there's this big question mark still remaining over constitutional recognition and the voice, and a lot of committee work still to go on that front. Ken Wyatt's got some pretty strong views himself. I've interviewed him over the years on this idea of the voice to Parliament. So it'll be interesting to see, now that he's got the job as minister, what he does with it.
And it'll be interesting to see too, I saw that the NDIS minister, there's actually going to be a dedicated minister for the NDIS. I
think that's great. I think that's a really positive move as well. And Stuart Robert does have a lot of energy. And look, this is one of the areas crying out for, some real action from government, particularly federal government, but state as well, to get the service delivery right. It's a huge new body that's still obviously finding out. You talk to anyone who's had engagement interface with the NDIS and you'll hear the problems. They've got this underspend going on, and yet the enormous demand is there. So clearly something's going wrong at the moment, and now it's Stuart Robert's task, and this will be a big task for him, to show that he's got what it takes to fix one of these problem areas for the government.
And then I thought it was really interesting, straight out of the gate, he wanted to say we've got a record number of women. Yep. It's still not an overwhelming number of women.
No, it is a record. He's maintaining that. We had the departure, of course, of Kelly O'Dwyer, and look, with Melissa Price dropping out to the junior ministry there as well. You've got Linda Reynolds, of course, staying as Defence Minister. You've got Susan Lee. I think it's good to see her coming back in. She, of course, was Health Minister before some of the problems around her property investments and so on, but she's back into the ministry. She had to obviously fight to hold her seat at the election as well, so I don't think that's any great surprise to see her coming back in there. They've got a balance, of course, not only keeping that level of women as it is, keeping the interstate balance roughly right, and acknowledging that Queensland's done particularly well for the coalition at this election, the balance between the two chambers, the House and the Senate. So while they don't have quotas per se, there's a lot to balance in these things, and of course the National Party and the Liberal Party have to have their representation.
And see, it is interesting. It does seem like there's been more movement around the Nationals in this ministerial shuffle. Why do you think that is? Look,
I think that's right, and I think Michael McCormack has a lot more authority himself now as the Nationals leader with this election win under the belt. And that puts to bed a lot of the speculation that we've seen really since he took the job as to whether Barnaby Joyce might be coming back. You never say never. He's not guaranteed the job for life by any means, but he's got more authority in this reshuffle to make some of the changes he wants. David Littleproud, as I say, has proven himself as a strong performer, deserves to be still in the cabinet, and he is. Bridget McKenzie, of course, deputy leader, is automatically in cabinet through that position. But some of the other changes there, you're right, are quite interesting to see. That look. Darren Chester maintains his portfolio responsibilities as well. So you've still got some continuity going on there too. You can't, after an election win like this, then go for wholesale change, and arguably there's good reason to stick with the senior team that he took to the election. And many of them, the likes of Josh Frydenberg and so on, have only been in the role 8-9 months, but others like Peter Dutton, Matthias Cormann, of course, Maurice Payne as Foreign Minister, they're all staying put. The changes that he has made, though, I think do make a lot of sense and follow the sort of election result we saw. There's a number of things the Prime Minister has to do with any sort of reshuffle. Firstly, you have to accommodate a certain number of Nationals based on how many seats they've won as proportion of the overall government win, and the Nationals essentially get to choose who is going into what role there. So that has to happen. He obviously, while there's no quota, can't afford to drop too many women out. So he's keeping 7, which is a record number that he had before the election. But given a couple of departures, 2 more women come in as 2 went out. One, Kelly O'Dwyer, who left before the election. The other, Melissa Price, who everyone's agreed has not performed well in the role of Environment Minister. My understanding is she actually came to the view herself that she would go. She's happy to keep a more junior ministry, but not Environment, not in Cabinet. So the 2 who go in were Susan Lee, who's previously been a Cabinet Minister, back now into Cabinet, and Anne Ruston as well. And I think they make a lot of sense. But then what he's had to do is also look at how each state performed in the election. We know that Queensland did particularly well. It delivered government for the government. So they are rewarded. Stuart Robert, close to the Prime Minister, elevated into Cabinet and given a specific and I think pretty important task of trying to fix the NDIS. Not necessarily be out there talking about it every day, but to get his head under the bonnet and really start to fix the problems with the National Disability Insurance Scheme. Other Queenslanders who held their seats, like Bert Van Manen, he gets a junior ministry as well. A couple of new Victorians in the mix. And again, it's those who, had to fight the swing in Victoria and hold on to their seats. Michael Sukkar, back now as Minister assisting the Treasurer. Jason Wood from Victoria as well. He comes back into the junior ministry too. But others like Tim Wilson will be disappointed that he hasn't been elevated here. But as I say, he's got to look at where the party performed well. Tasmania, they expanded their presence. 2 seats they won in the lower house there. So you get a Tasmanian coming in as well. So he's got to balance out how each state performed here, and that's what you see reflected today.
And a few West Australians. We've seen Ken Wyatt, Indigenous Minister. That's a big...
I think this is a really important move. Ken Wyatt becomes the first Minister for Indigenous Australians, and who is an Indigenous Australian, and the first Indigenous Cabinet Minister. Look, he has some pretty strong views, we know, and having interviewed him many times over the years on this about constitutional recognition and a voice to Parliament, it will be interesting to see how he handles that now he's in Cabinet as the Minister responsible. The priority, though, we know for Scott Morrison is really dealing with some of these issues around youth suicide in Indigenous communities and improving some of that service delivery as well. On the West Australians, though, we see, as mentioned, Melissa Price drop out of the Cabinet, and here was the Prime Minister talking briefly about that.
When Melissa and I discussed her role, she asked to be given a new challenge, and I was pleased to give her one.
So she's doing a good job in environment?
No, she's going to do a great job as the defence industry.
Is that in Cabinet, defence industry?
No.
That was no surprise. Everyone expected Melissa Price would be dropped, even though the Prime Minister said in that final debate that she'd stay as Environment Minister. As I said, it was, my understanding is, it was her acknowledgement that she had to go from Cabinet. She keeps a junior ministry. The most surprising thing today, though, are those who are leaving not just the ministry but the Parliament altogether. Mitch Fifield was the Communications Minister for many years. He's out of Cabinet and will be out of Parliament. He'll be going to New York as Australia's ambassador to the United Nations. Arthur Sinodinos looked like being promoted to the Cabinet and I'm told was offered the choice of a ministry. He instead will go to the even more prestigious diplomatic role, the number 1, as Australia's ambassador to Washington, following Joe Hockey. A very big deal indeed. And Arthur Sinodinos, we know, has got his health back after his cancer. He's battled with cancer. So this will be a pretty big step up for him. But one outside of the Parliament representing Australia on the world stage.
And it opens it up for Scott Morrison to have a few captain's picks for the Senate as well.
Well, yes, because they're senators, the way they are replaced is simply the party chooses. You don't have a by-election or anything like that. So the speculation will be Jim Molan coming back in. He's missed out, of course, on re-election, so he could take Arthur Sinodinos' Senate spot in New South Wales. In Victoria, there would be a few options to replace Mitch Fifield in the Senate. One of them may be Sarah Henderson, who just missed out on Corangamite as well. The other, in terms of structural changes, there are a few of them. As mentioned, the specific minister in Stuart Robert for the NDIS. We've got a few other changes around the immigration portfolio as well, bringing back in migrant services and multicultural affairs that used to be in immigration but then left. Now they're back, and David Coleman retains responsibility for immigration. Angus Taylor stays in energy. There was a lot of speculation on what they might do here. So energy is still in Angus Taylor's patch, but they bring back into energy emissions reduction. You recall when Josh Frydenberg held the job, he was Minister for Energy and the Environment, and that included emissions reduction. When Scott Morrison became Prime Minister, that was split apart. Angus Taylor was just the Minister for Energy. Melissa Price had Environment and had to deal with emissions reduction. But now it's a structural change here where they'll have an Environment Minister, but Angus Taylor will look after energy and emissions reduction. Here was the Prime Minister on that.
If you look closely at the Climate Solutions Fund and the other initiatives that are related to actually meeting our emissions reductions targets. I mean, it's Snowy 2.0, it's the Marinus Link, it's the Battery the Nation project. These projects fall very much into the role of energy infrastructure that Angus is closely associated with. And so it made, I think, a lot of sense to be able to bring that under the same banner.
And I think this is an acknowledgement that, they are the perfect match, energy and emissions reduction. I mean, when we look at what the government's doing in the energy spaces, you heard the Prime Minister say there, whether it's Snowy Hydro, whether it's the Marinus Link with Tasmania, whether it's underwriting various energy projects, it is about tackling the emissions issue here as well, even if they're not about to return to the sort of national energy guarantee model there. Look, the National Party also have some interesting changes here too. David Littleproud staying in Cabinet and... seems to me a bit of an overlapping portfolio here with Bridget McKenzie, who now takes on agriculture. Very important role for the Nats. But as Minister for Agriculture, she'll be sitting alongside David Littleproud, who'll be the Minister for Water Resources, Drought, Rural Finance, Natural Disaster, Emergency Management. Sounds like a lot of the things an Agriculture Minister would normally do.
Is it a bit of a demotion for David Littleproud? Just slightly sideways down a bit?
It may look that way, but it seems to me that he still takes picks the eyes out of the most challenging and interesting parts of the agriculture portfolio. We know water resources is right up there at the moment and certainly played out during the election. Drought, rural finance, this is still a very important role, particularly within the National Party.
And it would be some of the more high-profile stuff as well. No nod for Barnaby Joyce. It looks like he's out in the cold.
No ministry, and there was no mention of him retaining the role as envoy for the drought. There is an envoy, Warren Inch, for the Great Barrier Reef, but we don't see Barnaby Joyce listed on this lineup. Look, so some of those who'd be happy to be returning to the outer ministry, people like Michael Sukkar, as mentioned, Jason Wood, Tim Wilson, probably a bit disappointed that he's not there, but there are only so many places to go around, and I think the Prime Minister, on balance, has actually done a pretty good job with this list.
Yeah, well, I'm sure he'd be glad to hear it. Thank you, David Speers, for your analysis. We know that the party room will be meeting on Tuesday for the first time. They're still waiting for those writs to come back from the Australian Electoral Commission, counting all of the votes and declaring every single seat before they can recall Parliament, which, as we heard the Prime Minister flag, there might not be until July now, but he's been told potentially June 28th.